This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, something structural, something that has been running in the background for years, unnoticed, because it didn't feel dramatic enough to stop and stare. Power didn't collapse today. It slipped. And when systems slip, they don't announce it. They keep functioning, just differently. What looks like stability is often just momentum. What looks like strength is often leverage borrowed against the future. Most people assume systems fail when they explode. That's comforting, because explosions are obvious. But the most dangerous failures don't explode. They normalize. They become routine. They start rewarding behavior that should never have worked in the first place. And by the time anyone realizes what's actually been propping everything up, the rules have already changed. Stay with me, because once you see what was really holding this together, you can't unsee it. And what comes next is not about the past. It's about what this system does now. Here's the mistake most people make. They think power lives in people, in titles, in elections, in personalities that dominate the screen. But that's not where real control sits anymore. Real control lives in valuation, in spreadsheets, in assumptions quietly accepted because they are profitable to accept. What actually runs the system now is not belief. It's tolerance. Tolerance for numbers that don't quite add up. Tolerance for risk that gets rebranded as confidence. Tolerance for stories that are lucrative enough to suspend disbelief. This system doesn't ask whether something is true. It asks whether enough institutions are willing to treat it as if it were true. Banks, law firms, auditors, political fundraisers, each one touches the same fiction. Each one benefits, and each one assumes someone else will be responsible for stopping it. That's how control shifts, not through coups, through coordination without conspiracy. And once that coordination locks in, power no longer needs legitimacy. It only needs momentum, which brings us to the part that almost no one noticed while it was happening. The moment when exception quietly became operating system. There was a time when this kind of behavior was treated as a warning sign, an outlier, a red flag, something that triggered scrutiny. Back then, the numbers had to roughly agree with reality. They didn't have to be perfect, but they had to live on the same planet. That changed slowly, quietly, one exception at a time. First, inflated valuations were framed as optimism, then as branding, then as savvy negotiation. Before anyone realized it, the gap between what something was and what it was claimed to be stopped being a problem. It became a feature because as long as credit kept flowing, no one wanted to be the person who asked the uncomfortable question. As long as fees were generated, doubt was inconvenient. So the system adapted, not by correcting the behavior, but by absorbing it. Two versions of reality began to coexist. One for loans, one for taxes, one for private rooms, another for public filings. And the most dangerous part wasn't the deception itself. It was how normal it became. Because once a system learns to live with fiction, it starts building on top of it. And that's when a correction stops being technical and starts becoming existential. The correction didn't arrive as a debate or a warning or a negotiation. It arrived as paperwork, a judge, an emergency order, a transfer of control, not symbolic, operational, a property that had functioned as a nerve center, financial, political, logistical, was suddenly no longer fully accessible to the person who built their power around it. Events stopped. Rooms went dark. Decisions now required permission. On paper, this looked like a dispute over numbers, valuations, loans, taxes. But that's not what made this a shock. The shock was that the system finally treated the fiction as material, as actionable, as something that could be seized. This wasn't punishment. It was interruption. And interruptions are dangerous to systems built on momentum. Because when a core asset stops functioning the way it always has, everything downstream starts recalculating risk. Quietly, immediately. Stay with me here. Because what this action exposed wasn't just one discrepancy. It exposed the mechanism that allowed the discrepancy to exist at scale. And once that mechanism is visible, it doesn't stay contained. Here's how this actually works. Not in theory. In practice, the system doesn't rely on belief. It relies on plausible acceptance. A number gets written down. That number unlocks a loan. The loan generates fees. Another number gets written down somewhere else. That number reduces taxes. The savings stay private. No single institution sees the whole picture. And the ones that do don't need to look too closely, because everyone in the chain gets paid before the consequences arrive. Risk is sliced thin, distributed, deferred. When it works, the rewards are immediate. When it fails, the damage is abstract. Future, someone else's problem. This is why the system tolerated it for so long, not because it was fooled, but because it was profitable. And once enough institutions quietly agree to treat fantasy as collateral, the fantasy gains weight. It becomes leverage. It becomes authority, which means when the correction finally comes, it doesn't hit one actor. It hits the entire architecture that normalized the lie. And that's when cooperation stops being optional. Then the pace changes. One institution cooperates, another recalculates, a third quietly prepares an exit. Documents move, emails surface. Internal language becomes external evidence. What used to be aggressive becomes indefensible. What used to be tolerated becomes radioactive. Access tightens. Liquidity shrinks. Assets stop behaving like assets. Support doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. It delays. It comes with conditions. Every delay sends a signal. Every condition changes the math. This is how cascades begin, not with headlines, with spreadsheets. And once a cascade starts, loyalty becomes a liability, because staying attached to the fiction now carries risk. Legal risk, reputational risk, financial risk. That's when distance becomes survival. And when distance spreads faster than trust, even the strongest structures start to feel hollow, which brings this out of abstraction. And directly to you, here's where this stops being theoretical. Because systems like this don't fail in boardrooms. They fail where you live. You feel it when costs rise, but accountability doesn't. When institutions tighten rules for you, but bend them for people with leverage. When market forces are used as an explanation instead of a responsibility. You're told this is just how business works, that this is sophisticated, that you wouldn't understand the complexities. But you understand fairness, and you understand when the rules change depending on who's asking. When a system rewards deception at the top, the pressure doesn't disappear. It travels downward into higher prices, lower trust, thinner margins for everyone else. And the most dangerous part? You're expected to keep participating as if nothing's wrong. If this feels familiar, it's because you've been living inside the consequences of this model for years. Don't look away yet, because what's happening now doesn't stay contained. It never does. Once this kind of system is exposed, it doesn't remain domestic. Capital doesn't respect borders. Risk doesn't either. The same institutions that tolerated fiction in one place operate everywhere. The same assumptions get exported. The same shortcuts get normalized. When confidence cracks at the center, it ripples outward. Investors hesitate, lenders reprice risk. Allies start asking questions they didn't ask before, not because they suddenly care about ethics, but because uncertainty is contagious. What looked like a localized problem becomes a credibility issue. Not about one actor, but about whether the numbers can be trusted at all. And once trust becomes a variable, everything slows down. Deals take longer. Capital costs more. Promises need proof. That drag doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, and systems under drag don't collapse cleanly. They grind, which is why the next phase isn't about punishment. It's about direction. Because from here, there are only a few ways this can move forward. From here, the system accelerates, but it doesn't accelerate in just one direction. There are three paths. The first is adjustment. Institutions quietly tighten standards. Valuations shrink back toward reality. Risk becomes boring again. Nothing dramatic happens, but power slowly rebalances. Momentum fades. The second path is erosion. Rules remain flexible, but selectively enforced. Corrections happen only when exposure becomes impossible to ignore. The system keeps functioning, but trust keeps thinning, and each exception makes the next one easier. Then there's the third path, rupture. That's when enforcement arrives late and all at once. When cooperation turns into self-preservation. When assets freeze faster than narratives can adjust, rupture doesn't target one actor. It exposes everyone who relied on the same assumptions. Which path unfolds depends on what happens next. Not publicly, quietly, in filings, in negotiations, in decisions you won't see until they're irreversible. And that brings us to the final question. Not about guilt, not about punishment, but about what kind of system survives this moment. Systems don't collapse when they're exposed. They collapse when they're tested. Exposure is just information. A test forces a choice. This moment isn't asking whether deception happened. That part is already visible. It's asking whether a system that learned to profit from distortion can still correct itself without tearing, because once fiction is treated as collateral, reversing course isn't neutral. Someone pays, someone always does. The danger now isn't chaos, it's normalization. Normalization of the idea that truth is negotiable, that rules are adjustable. That accountability is situational. If that becomes the lesson absorbed from this moment, then the correction fails even if enforcement succeeds. So don't watch this like a spectator. Watch the reactions. Watch who distances themselves. Watch what gets quietly rewritten, because the next phase won't announce itself with sirens or speeches. It will arrive disguised as stability. And if you want to understand where this system is actually headed, who adapts, who erodes, and who doesn't survive the rupture, stay with this story. We're not done watching it yet.